Hey y'all, I'm Carrie,
Hello, I'm Ashley.
and this is Monstrous. Right, are we ready?
Yeah.
Sorry, I had to take a drink. Alright, so this is our last episode of the year. 2024. Yay. Alright, so before we dive in today, we have something special for the holiday season. Woo! So you'll be getting your normal episode today, along with a bonus case episode that Ashley is working on this week. Some fun stuff happening over here.
Very fun.
We are also going to take all of January off to celebrate the holidays with our families, start off the new year, all of that stuff. We also have some things that we're working on for the new year. So during this time off, we're going to get those things together and finalized before we start doing those. So we will be back for our regular episodes and with an exciting announcement on February 3rd. I'm not sure whose case will be that episode. Those are details we are going to get finalized during our time off. But we will come back in February on the 3rd with our shit together. So we'll get it figured out by then. Okay, so now let's get into it. So as normal, this case has a listener discretion advised, as all of our episodes do, just because of the topics we discuss. But I want to advise to listen with extreme caution, because this episode specifically does include mentions of drugs, sexual situations, and murder. So the case I have for today is a Christmas one, and it turns 32 years old this year. Today's case spans over several days. There are a lot of names that I have to throw at you. We're going to be bouncing around in the timeline just a little bit in different parts. So I've done my best to make sure that it all makes sense and that everyone is able to follow along. I will have some photos that go with the episode as well, which can be found on our Facebook page, as always. So this case is about a group of teens that wreaked havoc on the town of Dayton, Ohio in 1992. Behind them, they left 6 dead and 2 others injured. There was no real motive for their crimes. What began as petty robberies shortly escalated to something much more monstrous. In only 3 days, this group of teens who called themselves the Downtown Posse went from being petty criminals to joy killers. This is the Dayton, Ohio Christmas killings. So Dayton, Ohio is a mid-sized city. In the 1800s, Dayton was a thriving industrial hub. They had survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, and both World Wars. But Dayton would not survive through the 1970s. Most of America's industrial work had moved overseas, causing most Daytonians to move outside of the city. Even through these hard times, the old Dayton from the 1930s remained alive. Housing discrimination and a roaring drug epidemic meant residents continued to struggle in this one thriving city. To explain how bad things were in Dayton at the time, I have some numbers to throw at you. So by the end of the 1990s, Daytonians were 3.5 times more likely to be impoverished than those living in suburban areas. The youth were far more vulnerable. 40% of children under 17 in Dayton were living in poverty. The racial disparities were vastly different as well. 30% of the Black community lived in poverty, while only 17% of the white community did at the exact same time. It was this atmosphere that raised a bitter and resentful teen that led a gang through Dayton leaving violence and fear behind them. Marvelous Keene was born in 1973. He came from a well-liked family. He grew up attending church and was even a choir boy. His brother Maurice was a year older, and the two were very close. So close that many believed the two were actually twins. There wasn't much known about the boys' father that I could find. What I could find was that he had left the family after Bernice, who was the boys' mother, had brought Marvelous home from the hospital. At some point, Bernice had remarried, but according to sources, this man would often leave and disappear for long periods of time, which ultimately led the marriage to end as well. The lack of a like he would just like, peace out. I'll be back when I come back.
Like, don't come back.
Right, exactly. Like, don't let the door hit you with a good Lord split you, my guy.
Right.
So the lack of a consistent father left both boys struggling, obviously. Studies show the absence of a father in early childhood has a large negative impact on the child in many ways, which leads to higher numbers of risky behavior and delinquency, especially in boys. Despite this, though, all accounts about Marvelous say for the first 17 years of his life, he was what many would call a model child. He was a good student, he was quiet, and somewhat religious. But this all changed when Marvelous was 18. When his older brother was shot and killed in an attempted robbery at only 19 years old. According to their mother, Marvelous had an extremely hard time dealing with this loss. This grief led Marvelous to vow that he would get revenge for his brother's death. According to a Swedish study, one of the most important relationships during the adolescent years is the connection between siblings. So losing a sibling can be traumatic for anyone, and it can lead to a greater risk of psychiatric issues later on. So much so that another psychological study stated that the type of loss Marvelous experienced results in, quote, a considerable mental disorder burden among surviving siblings. So, while Marvelous is struggling with the loss of his brother, he is also feeling like a type of survivor's guilt in a way. Like,
Yeah, I can understand that.
Why was it him and not me kind of thing. So, Marvelous began to see the world around him in a very different light. It's like 1 minute, it's all unicorns and rainbows, and then the next he realizes like how dark the world really is. But this was not the only major change in Marvelous's life. After the death of his older brother, his mom Bernice sent him to live with his biological father in California. There isn't much information on his life there, but what I do know based on statements from his stepmother was that he held a job in construction. He graduated from high school in March of 1992. She said that every day he went to school, work, and then he came home. So it seemed like life became normal again for Marvelous once he went to California. His relationship with his father, though, was said to be strained. Marvelous's father stated that while Marvelous lived there, he behaved irresponsibly and he even had to kick Marvelous out in the summer of 1992 after only being there for a year and a half. So it seems that his dad and stepmom either had different views of what was going on at the time, or his stepmom could have been trying to protect him in a way. Not sure which one. So following this, Marvelous had moved back to his mom's in Dayton, where he had found a job in a nursing home. Bernice was adamant that California had changed her son. Before he had left, Marvelous was violent, withdrawn, and spent most of his time in downtown Dayton, where he had found a group of friends who were runaways, drug dealers, and petty criminals. Upon his return, though, it seemed as if California had given Marvelous the fresh start that he needed to get his head straight. But his mother and all of Dayton would soon find out that that was not true at all. No one in California knew Marvelous. No one knew that he came from a good family, got good grades in school, or that he was a literal choir boy. So with this, a new persona was born. Marvelous got a sharp box haircut, boasted about being in with the Crips, and claimed he had gone to jail. All of which was untrue. Marvelous went so far to make his new persona believable that he even began carrying a gun around with him. There isn't anything that I could find proving that Marvelous was a part of a gang while he was in California, despite what he claims. It is believed, however, that he spent a lot of time studying the gang scene, which, according to Dayton psychologist Dr. Michael Williams, this had led Marvelous to develop a, quote, villainous alter ego that gave him status and recognition. The bonus for Marvelous was that in Dayton, he didn't actually have to be a part of a California gang to make others believe it. His friends were committed to him, and most of this commitment seemed to come from the memory of his older brother. And these memories seemed to fuel Marvelous's violence further when he himself turned 19, the same age his brother was when he was murdered. According to one of Marvelous's friends, he desperately wanted revenge for his brother's death. His friend stated many were afraid of Marvelous because he was filled with anger and often bragged about or showed off his guns. This same friend said this fear and anger made you unsure on if he would shoot you or not. So I want to point out that after his crimes, Marvelous was diagnosed with PTSD, which more than likely contributed to not only his behavior, but his crimes as well. I want to stress...
There's a lot of trauma.
It, like, changes your, like, brain makeup. Like, your brain doesn't work the same. So it just kind of... You kind of go into survival mode, basically. Like, you do whatever you have to do to survive.
Yep.
But hold on to that, because that opinion will probably change. So I want to stress that there is no way to say that his PTSD caused his vicious acts, for sure. But we do know that most people with PTSD are not violent, although it does increase the risk of becoming violent. Because, like we just said, it changes the way your brain works. So, as you know, Ashley, I suffer from severe PTSD myself. So, I can understand where that risk factor comes from.
Oh, yeah.
But for our listeners that don't know much about PTSD, I'm going to break down some of the psychology of it and the effects that it has on people. Obviously, any mental illness, any psychological issues that you have, including PTSD, anxiety, all those things, they affect everyone differently. So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. But we're going to break it down a little bit. So on a simple level, PTSD heightens your fight or flight response, and it keeps you kind of in like a constant guard state, whether there's a threat or not. You're always waiting for something to happen. So PTSD appears in two forms. You have your normal reactive PTSD, and then you have complex PTSD, which is more severe of the two. The two are very similar, and you can actually have both forms at the same time, but they are two separate diagnoses. So reactive PTSD is caused by short-term trauma. So in other words, a single traumatic event, like a car crash or, something like that. These PTSD symptoms include avoiding people, places, or the events that could trigger a memory of the trauma. You have flashbacks, you may experience nightmares or insomnia, which causes you to be tired often. PTSD can also cause physical responses such as pain in your body, tense muscles, shaking. And most people with PTSD also suffer from anxiety, depression, as well as panic attacks. And then, all the things that come with those diagnoses. Complex PTSD, on the other hand, is from long-term or repeated trauma, so like domestic violence or child abuse. As the name suggests, this form is much more complex. So, along with the symptoms I mentioned before, those with complex PTSD, like myself, also suffer from lapse in memory, substance abuse, self-harm, headaches, low self-esteem. They often partake in risky behavior. They often have the inability to regulate their emotions. They have complete memories just completely go missing, and the list just goes on. So, obviously,
There's a lot when it comes to PTSD.
oh yeah, PTSD is no joke. And a lot of people don't understand, like, it's not just, people that have been in wars and in the military that have PTSD. Literally anyone can have PTSD. It comes from, people who have been in car crashes end up with short-term PTSD, and they have to work through that. If you grow up in a not so stable home and there's abuse and you're around traumatic things, you end up with PTSD. And the longer the traumatic event goes on, the worse the PTSD gets. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize that. Like, it's a real thing. It is very serious. Some people are able to, figure out how they can operate and live with it, and others can't. Unfortunately, it's just kind of one of those things that until people really look into it, no one's really going to understand that it is very serious. And there's a lot of people that PTSD affects. It doesn't just affect the person that has it.
Right.
So obviously, I'm not a psychologist, clearly. But in my opinion, based on Marvelous's violence and the need that he felt to appear as this newfound California gangbanger, I would bet that he suffered from complex PTSD. Very well could be wrong. Obviously, I don't know. I've never met him. Just from what I know, I feel like that's the form of PTSD that he had. Obviously, I'm not excusing his actions in any way, but living nearly my entire life with PTSD and struggling at his young age, I can see how the violence just took over one day. And it was just, that's who he became. He was a traumatized and very angry young man. And sadly, he too became a victim of violence, and he allowed these things to consume him, and it turned him into the vicious killer that he would become. Marvelous took on a double life with his friends. He was the leader to a group of wayward teens, but at home, he was a new man, no longer violent or vengeful. And this is where his PTSD being to blame for his actions stops. Though his diagnosis affects everyone differently, it isn't something you can just turn on and turn off.
Right.
So him being able to go back and forth points that this was something much more worse than simply him having PTSD and just snapping one day. So in early December of 1992, Marvelous decided the type of person that he would be. He quit his nursing job and moved into an apartment with his friends. This was what they called the headquarters for the downtown posse. By 1992, Dayton's downtown area and its center was ran by the downtown posse. This group was full of dropouts and runaways. They spent most of their days downtown, hence the name. Here they sat around drinking and bumming money off of people that passed them. When the group wasn't in the center of Dayton, they were on Courthouse Square, where they stayed at a public housing apartment that Marvelous had lived in. The apartment was owned by Bill McIntyre, but drifters and runaways came and went, which earned the neighborhood a bad reputation. The building was widely known as a drug house. Though this was a bad place to be for many in Dayton, to the teens that lived there, it was the closest thing to home. They had the family-like dynamic, which is common in most gangs. This gave the teens what they were missing. Many of these kids had been ostracized at home or had been abandoned, so this gave them some type of family. In most gangs, there are rules that you have to follow. There's a clear leader, all of that. But for the downtown posse, this didn't exist. They traded partners, they did drugs, and basked in the like-minded community that they had created. So, some of these kids were locals, others were runaways, as I had said before. One of these runaways included Marvelous's girlfriend, who was 16-year-old Laura Taylor. Laura was a tiny girl. Some said she was sweet, while others said she was cold. Her hardened demeanor could have been a defense mechanism as a way to compensate for her small size. Not sure. Around September of 1992, Laura had been expelled from 9th grade, and following that, she ran away. Her home life isn't clear, but one source said that her family, in fact, wanted her, and they did their best with her. After she left home, she was obviously in need of a place to stay. And this is when 28-year-old Jeffrey Wright brought her to the apartment complex that the local needy kids used. Marvelous was known as the group leader, and Jeffrey was the group connector. He brought in runaways, and he himself would sometimes sleep there as well as date the young girls that passed through. So we got a lot going on here, okay? We got some runaways, we have, wayward kids, we have drug dealers, and then we have a 28-year-old sleeping with teen kids. There's a lot happening. Yeah, a lot going on already. And it's just going to get worse. So one of these said relationships that Jeffrey Wright was involved in was with 20-year-old Heather Matthews. Marvelous had been the first to meet Heather and bring her back to their headquarters after they had met on Courthouse Square after she was released from prison. Yeah. Heather had grown up in Dayton. She was raised by a single mother, and to make her story even harder, she never knew her father. Heather's family recalls her as a sweet child, but when middle school rolled around, she had fallen in with the wrong crowd. She began drinking, doing drugs, and committing thefts until she was expelled from school. They stated she was a sweet girl that was easily corrupted by the evils of the world. Her own mother stated, quote, "If someone jumped off a bridge, she'd do it too." Heather was a follower by nature and did as anyone around her did, no matter the consequences. So after arriving at the apartment, she briefly dated Jeffrey Wright, but eventually she would move on to 17-year-old DeMarcus Smith. So I don't have any information on how DeMarcus grew up, his life, or where he was before 1992. Couldn't find anything about him. It's like he just, poof, out of nowhere, just appeared. So what I do know is at the time that everything happened, in our case today, he was on parole. And the police were actually looking for him because of a parole violation. Yes. So like the other members of the downtown posse, he went to the apartment looking for refuge. So the 4 teens I have just told you about, Marvelous, Laura, Heather, and DeMarcus, were all somewhat estranged from their families at the time that they came together. Each of them had a tendency to turn towards rebellion and had a disregard for the rules. Marvelous bragged about his supposed gang involvement. Laura was a runaway. And then Heather and DeMarcus had been to jail. At drugs and the occasional spurts of violence, it was really no surprise that this group of wayward teens became hardened criminals, eventually adding guns into the mix. So it's not clear where they got these guns from, but the main gun toter was Marvelous. This alone most likely made him the posse leader. And Laura, being his then girlfriend, became something like the cold-hearted second in command. Marvelous had confidence. The guns and his stories of a life in California gave him power of those around him, but his tough guy persona had cracks that were lurking just under the surface. So after leaving his mother's home, he had quit his job, and it appears as though he had lost touch with her over time as well. And his brother's death was still gnawing at him. He had promised to get revenge, and he still hadn't. With no money or a means to survive, it began to seem as though Marvelous had nothing left to lose. So winter in Ohio of 1992 came around. It's commonly cold. Temperatures tend to drop below zero, especially during snowstorms. This December, though, was shockingly warm for the area. The days were in the mid-40s, and the sunny afternoons meant the holiday season was more pronounced than years past. Parades marched down Main Street, and a tree had been lit on the square. Storefronts were decorated with lights and other decorations, but in the days leading up to Christmas, the temperatures dropped. But these cold temperatures did not deter the Dayton youth from roaming around. In the early frigid hours of Christmas Eve morning in 1992, Laura and Marvelous were plotting. They needed money, and they needed it quick. It's not clear why they needed the money, but I guess because they didn't have jobs or contact with their parents, they had to figure out another way to get it. Many speculate that it wasn't really a need for money that drove them. It was just they were bored and they wanted something to do. So we've all been teens, and we all know that most of the time teenage boredom isn't harmless. Bad things are often thought of out of teenage boredom. A 2003 study conducted by the National Center of Addiction and Substance Abuse found that boredom is a major influence of risky behavior in teens, such as drinking, substance abuse, and so on. According to another study, bored teens are 50% more likely to smoke, drink, and use drugs. That is why my children will partake in after-school activities. You don't have time to be bored. So, in other words, these two restless teens, not tied down to anything or anyone, who were fueled by the holiday joy around them, needed something to do with their boredom. They were looking for a thrill. So Laura and Marvelous knew a 34-year-old man named Joseph Wilkerson, who Laura thought she could get some cash off of. She was sure he would pay her for sex. Allegedly, Laura had come up with this idea, and it was said that she was very eager to prove herself to Marvelous, a chance to show him that she can entice a man with very little effort. Which I'm not really sure why she would want to do that, but
It's kind of fucked up. Like,
I don't know where
your fucking body.
Yeah, I'm not sure where her head was at that time, so who knows? Maybe the drugs, or I'm not sure. So after Joseph had agreed, the two teens had looped in Heather with the plan, and according to Heather, she had been led to believe that they were simply just going to steal Joseph's car. Around 4 a.m., the trio had walked 3 miles to Joseph's home. Once inside, Joseph had unclothed, and the girls began to get undressed as well. Then Joseph laid on his bed. Marvelous was said to have been standing by and watching the whole ordeal going down, knowing that he had a secret. Marvelous had brought a gun with him. Marvelous pulls out his loaded .25 caliber firearm and pointed it right at Joseph, who begged for his life. Despite Joseph having it all, his own home, 2 cars, and everything he could want, Marvelous in that moment was the one in control. Laura and Heather had tied Joseph to his own bed using electrical cords. Then Marvelous told them to check out the house to see what they could find, and the girls did just that. As the girls ransacked the house, Marvelous stood in the room with Joseph deciding what to do. He knew they could score, but Joseph knew them and could point the police in their direction. And Marvelous did not want to go to jail, so he made a decision. One that would change the course of his life, and one that he could not take back. Marvelous took pillows off the bed and placed them over Joseph's chest, ignoring Joseph's pleas to live. Marvelous pressed his gun into the pillow, covering Joseph's chest, while Joseph continued to plead with Marvelous for an unknown reason, maybe in hopes that it would get Marvelous away from him so he could escape. He told Marvelous that he had a .32 gauge Deranger gun in his garage. And after hearing this, Marvelous retrieved the gun to only return, now with 2 guns pointing at Joseph. Meanwhile, the girls found some good stuff to steal. Would you like to know what they found?
Let's hear it.
A microwave, a small TV, a phone, a curling iron, and a blow dryer, along with a few Christmas gifts that Joseph had for his family.
For real.
Yep. Yeah. So at some point, while they were ransacking the house, Laura and Heather heard a gunshot. They ran into Joseph's room where they had found Joseph on the bed, shot straight through the heart. It was clear what had taken place in their absence. But for Heather, it didn't compute, and so she asked, quote, "Did you shoot him or something?" Clearly, this girl is not the brightest.
He's just lying or, you know.
Exactly. And Marvelous's reply was simple, quote, "Yeah, I shot him, let's go."
Damn.
Yeah, just straight to the point. Don't give, yeah, now we're leaving. Okay. So before leaving, Marvelous had handed the gun that he had taken from and shot Joseph with to Laura. She turned, pointed it at Joseph, and tried to shoot, but the gun didn't go off. So Marvelous instead handed her the gun that he had brought with them. This time, the gun fired, and Laura shot the deceased Joseph in the head. Like he's already dead, girlfriend. You don't need to do all that. Exactly. Like, that's not necessary. So based off of this, the same psychologist that had diagnosed Marvelous with PTSD stated that he believed that Marvelous had also suffered from a passive-aggressive personality disorder. Some markers that are present with this type of personality disorder include resentment or envy, hostility, and feeling as if the person was cheated, each of which can be seen in Marvelous and could have ultimately been the driving force in his decision to kill Joseph. Joseph had everything in life and was successful, while Marvelous and his friends were not. In other words, Joseph's mere existence gave Marvelous a reason to hate him and be hostile towards him. So, after the three teens had hotwired one of Joseph's car, which Heather had experience in doing, they returned to their apartment around 7 a.m. But of course, they had the high of adrenaline from their crime still coursing through them. Between the adrenaline and their new stuff, they couldn't just sit by and do nothing. These teens had crossed the line. They hadn't just committed some petty crime. They had committed murder. Most of us would have panicked at this point, but instead, the posse seemed invigorated by it. And as Sergeant George Hammond stated, quote, "They were like a shark. Once they tasted blood, they couldn't stop." From here, they went to an arcade that was located downtown, which is where they had met up with Heather's boyfriend, DeMarcus Smith. According to one source, they all went to a local restaurant and decided to discuss who they were going to rob next. Like, we just murdered someone. Now who are we going to, steal from next? It's a normal, everyday conversation between friends. So it's unknown what they had told DeMarcus or if he knew that his girlfriend and her two friends had just killed somebody. But it's most likely that he knew after the fact, because according to many, Marvelous and Laura had seemed proud about the crime that they had just committed. And DeMarcus was a new member that they could brag about it to. So whether he had intent to kill or not, DeMarcus was eager to join in on the goal of a Christmas score. They decided who their next victim was, and once again, Laura was their bait. Outside the restaurant, Laura had flagged down a stranger in a way that would make it clear she was there to provide sexual services. Though it's not clear whether or not she actually intended to engage in any kind of sex work, she gave off that, persona. Once inside the stranger's car, the two drove around for a while DeMarcus and Marvelous had tailed behind them. Once the stranger had found a place to park, the two boys parked their stolen car and approached the vehicle, guns ready. The strangers saw the boys and hit the gas. The boys fired on the car as it drove off, and Laura jumped out of the moving vehicle. Their unsuccessful attempt to kill and rob this man, of course, left him feeling anticlimactic. And even though they had managed to get away from Joseph's home with some stuff, they still didn't have any cash. And so, their night wasn't over yet. The foursome had wandered around Dayton looking for their next victim. Sometime around 10 p.m., the group walked by 18-year-old Danita Gillette, who was standing at a phone booth. Danita had been staying at her brother's home just around the corner from the phone booth. It's likely she was trying to call her sister at the time, who had been taking care of Danita's 2-year-old daughter while she finished school. They had allegedly noticed Danita's shoes, which were an expensive pair of Fila's, and the group wanted them. And it's likely that these shoes made them believe that Danita probably had cash on her, because at the time, Fila's were really expensive. They were the had to have. So they approached Danita, guns drawn. Marvelous had told Danita to take off her shoes and the flannel jacket that she had on, which she had borrowed from a friend of hers. And Danita did exactly that. DeMarcus took the shoes, and that's when Marvelous and DeMarcus both shot Danita. Danita had been shot multiple times, in her stomach, chest, leg, and hand. Joseph, I guess, could have been seen as a threat, but Danita was a young girl with no weapon and no knowledge of who these people were. So what threat could she have been? What was her crime? Having nice shoes? After taking Danita's jacket and her shoes, they fled, leaving 18-year-old Danita bleeding to death on the sidewalk. The teens had no idea how sloppy they were being. They had left a trail of evidence linking 2 murders, and it was only a matter of time until the trail had led to them. Because there had been witnesses to Danita's murder. A few people saw the group take off running down the middle of the street, and a couple of them stated the smallest member of the group, which is most likely Laura, had swore at them as they had ran by. It's clear being caught was not a concern of theirs, because they had made no attempt to cover their tracks. In fact, following the shooting of Danita, the group had returned to their home and partied with their friends. So they just shot a 19-year-old mother for literally no reason, and then went home and partied. Yeah. According to these friends, the foursome had even bragged about what they had done. So now I'm going to introduce some other key figures in today's case. So we have Nick Woodson, Marvin Washington, and Wendy Cottrell. I couldn't really find anything about Marvin at all, but Nick was a local to Dayton, and he had family living nearby. Now for Wendy, she was a runaway. She had left home after she had found out that she was pregnant, and she had also been brought into the posse by Jeffrey about the same time that Laura had. So later in the night, on Christmas Eve, Heather's ex, Jeffrey Wright, had showed up. There were a few different versions of how the events to follow had occurred. Not really sure which one is for sure, so I'm going to tell you both. First is that he had showed up looking for Heather, and after he arrived, Jeffrey and DeMarcus, who was Heather's current boyfriend, had gotten into a heated argument. Some sources say that the reason for the altercation was because Jeffrey had allegedly beat Heather up. Another version of what happened is that the altercation took place outside the apartment. A friend of the posse stated that Jeffrey just knew too much, and that was why DeMarcus had attacked him. But no matter what happened with the altercation, the end result was the same. DeMarcus had pulled a gun on Jeffrey, and after seeing it, Jeffrey ran, making it to courtyard before DeMarcus shot him in the leg 4 times. It's possible that DeMarcus, Marvelous, Laura, and Heather all believed that Jeffrey was dead, but he wasn't. We know that at least 2 others, Wendy and Marvin, had saw the incident go down. There are other possible witnesses as well that just never came forward. So Jeffrey's shooting was just another link in the growing evidence leading to the group. Just like the rest of the case, what happened next varies on who you talk to. The 4 definitely knew that the gunshots would bring them attention, and they didn't want that because their place was only a few blocks from the local police station. So they knew they had to get out of there fast. According to a few fellow posse members, Nick Woodson had offered his aunt's house as refuge for the 4 teens, but they had declined it. According to another source, the group had fled to Joseph Wilkerson's house, who was the first person that they had killed in this spree, before they had then returned to their apartment building for the night. While another source says that they had actually spent the night at Joseph's house. This one seems to be more likely because the teens would eventually begin to use Joseph's house as their home base. Another source alleged that Marvelous said that they, quote, partied at Joe's house for 2 or 3 days and ate his food. This source went on to say that the group had a great time and that they had even showed people Joseph's body. Right? Like, let's just party in this guy's house that we killed and just, show people his body, because that's not on a whole other level of fucked up.
Not normal at all.
No. Like, I don't know what these kids had going on, but they had some problems for sure.
For sure.
So these other people that they had allegedly showed Joseph's body to was Wendy and Marvin, who had been over to join in on the group's antics. According to the book, The Christmas Killings, 40 Hours to Justice, they came over in response to Laura's urging, which was, quote, hey, put some drama in your life. Girlfriend, I feel like that's a little bit more than drama. Yeah. So it is possible, and most likely, that as Christmas Eve drew to a close, that these teens were plotting their next attack in the very house where this entire thing began, because at this point, they were beyond caring. Their 2 murders so far had opened up a world for them. They didn't have to panhandle strangers for money anymore. Now, they could just take it. For the first time in their lives, they were in control. The downtown posse were the ones with all the power. So now we're going to skip ahead to December 26th of 1992. 71-year-old Jimmy Thompson has stopped at the local shortstop mini mart in Dayton. This was a normal part of life for Jimmy. He was a regular at the mini mart, and sometimes he would even pick up some shifts working there to help the store out. The store was, of course, decorated for the holiday season, and it was pretty much empty on this morning. There was only the owner, 38-year-old Sarah Abraham, Jimmy, and one other customer inside the store. Sarah's family had immigrated to the U.S. from Ethiopia 8 years before, and after they had arrived in the States, she bought the store. At some point after Jimmy arrived, 16-year-old Laura walked in. She asked Sarah how much the soft drinks cost, and it turned out Laura was 5 cents short, and so Jimmy handed her a nickel so Laura could pay for her soda. Laura accepted the nickel, walked around the store a little bit longer, and then she left. A few minutes later, the door swung open, and before anyone could react, 2 young men came barreling in, pointing guns at Sarah. They demanded everything she had in the register, and the young men didn't need to say anything more than that. It was clear she either did what they wanted, or they would shoot everyone in the store. Before I tell you how this one ends, we're going to go back to Christmas Day. 19-year-old Marvelous was enjoying a midday Christmas lunch at the home of Nick Woodson's aunt. With these 2, there were Heather Matthews, Laura Taylor, and DeMarcus Smith. And of course, Nick's girlfriend, Melissa Gomez. And it sounds like a great day. A group of misfit teens, together with the people they have chosen to be their family, celebrating the holiday with a nice lunch. But looks are deceiving, and the illusion of an innocent day was shattered as soon as Heather began to talk. Allegedly, Heather had told Melissa where DeMarcus had gotten those Fila shoes that he was wearing. She told Melissa that he had stolen them from a girl that they had shot and killed the night before. I don't know how Melissa reacted to being told this, but I'm sure she was taken aback by this. She had no idea how much trouble the group had truly gotten themselves into, and Danita's murder was only the tip of the iceberg. By the time the teens had killed 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson and 19-year-old Danita Gillette, as well as attempted to murder Jeffrey Wright. And shockingly, the group still had yet to get what they were really after. Even with all of this bloodshed, they still wanted money, so they were nowhere near done. Following their Christmas lunch, Marvelous, Heather, Laura, and DeMarcus returned to Joseph Wilkerson's house. While Joseph's body still lay in his bed where he had been shot, they raided his kitchen, stole more of his stuff, and bounced around ideas of who to rob next. Here is where Richard Maddox, Laura's ex-boyfriend, becomes their next victim. Laura had met Maddox at a homecoming dance while she was still in school. Richard only lived 2 blocks away from Joseph's home and a few miles from where Danita had been shot. So, if you remember, Laura had been the one to suggest that the group rob Joseph. And here she is offering up another victim. So even though Marvelous appeared to be the ringleader of the gang, it seemed like Laura was the planner. In fact, Nick Woodson would later say that Laura was the group's recruiter. But of course, Laura isn't all to blame. There were 3 other members to this killing group, and none of them made any attempt to speak up about what they were doing or even try to stop it. So, after Laura offers up Richard, they come up with a scheme to get him in a position that they could pull their plan off. Laura would get Richard alone by asking him if he wanted to go to a motel room. But their plan immediately had an issue. When Laura arrived at Richard's house, he had no interest in leaving with her. After 2 more failed attempts of getting him to leave, Marvelous and Laura went to an ATM to stake it out. Not really sure where DeMarcus and Heather were at this time, because it's not mentioned anywhere, but Marvelous and Laura went to the ATM on their own. It being winter and Christmas Day, the ATM, of course, wasn't all that popular, but they waited anyway. One person did end up coming by the ATM while the 2 were there, but they had missed this person because the 2 were busy having sex. But this didn't deter them. After the missed chance of easy cash, they decided to try to get Richard to leave one last time. Marvelous and Laura had then met up with Heather and DeMarcus. At some point, Laura was dropped off at Richard's house while the others waited in the car around the corner, ready to tell Richard and Laura if they had left. This time, Laura was able to convince Richard to leave. I'm not exactly sure how she got him to leave, but either way, she did. This time would be a failed attempt at getting cash as well, because what Laura and the group didn't know yet was that Richard had forgot to grab his wallet when he left his home. So there are 2 theories on what happened inside that car after they left. The first is that Laura had realized Richard had left his wallet and became angry with him. The other is that Richard had noticed the car with the rest of the group inside of it and knew there was trouble. No matter what happened, just as before, the end result is the same. Laura took the Duranger they had taken from Joseph's house, so the gun that they had stole from Joseph, and she shot Richard in the head while he was driving.
In the head while he was driving?
Yes.
Jesus.
Yeah. Laura had jumped from the car just before the car smashed into a tree. She ran from the scene until she reached a shopping center that was 2 blocks away from where she had just shot her ex-boyfriend in the head. The scene was loud, chaotic, messy, and Laura was covered in blood. But still, it ended in no payday for the group. Meanwhile, back at the scene, Marvelous and DeMarcus were attempting to yank Richard from the car that had just crashed into a tree in an attempt to steal the car. Yes. I'm not sure the logic, but that's what they wanted to do. But ultimately, they failed and they ran away too. According to Heather, the group had then met up with Laura, and she kept repeating, quote, "I shot him in the head, I shot him." It's not exactly clear how the group as a whole felt following this, but by Laura's account, there was a mixture of shock and thrill. And based on their later actions, at least one of them seemed proud of what they had done. After the shooting, they then met up with their friend Nick Woodson and bragged about their newest killing. Nick later recalled that Laura was limping at the time and she even had a cut on her hand, which, yeah, I'm sure she jumped out of a moving vehicle being driven by a dead guy.
She was.
Exactly, that's what I thought. Like, she's lucky that's all she had. So at the time, Nick seemed worried for obvious reasons. Nick was having regrets and warned his friends, but they didn't listen. Instead, they laughed at him and about what they had done. Christmas Day of 1992 has come to a close. And on December 26th, the teens are still fueled by their desire for some quick cash and their newfound bloodlust, which leads them to stalk Dayton, Ohio in the early morning hours. They chose 2 ATMs to stalk, waiting for someone to rob, but neither were successful. But they didn't give up either. It was early in the morning and not many people were out, which meant the teens had plenty of time to find another way to get some cash. Heather, acting as the group's chauffeur, drove around Dayton looking for their next victim, which they found at a BP gas station. She was at BP filling up her black Dodge Shadow when all of a sudden, Marvelous and DeMarcus rushed on her pointing guns. According to one source, the boys told the woman, quote, "You will die today." Like, no, I'm just trying to fill up my gas tank. Dying today is not on my agenda. But thank you. But they were wrong. The woman booked it out of there, leaving her Dodge Shadow behind. Marvelous and DeMarcus fired their guns at her, but she was able to get away. They didn't get any cash or take another life, but they got a car out of it. But they still needed money and a for sure thing somewhere with a cash register. Heather drove the group 3 miles down the road to the short stop mini mart on West 5th Street, a place again chosen by the group's planner, Laura. And now we are back to where we began this part of the story with Jimmy and Sarah. Laura had agreed to go in first to scope it out. It was just before 8 a.m. on December 26, 1992, and 38-year-old owner Sarah Abraham was working behind the counter when Laura walked in. Like I said before, Jimmy Thompson and one other customer, Jones Pettis, were the only other ones inside the store. Jimmy had given Laura a nickel to buy her soda, and after wandering around some, she left. Outside the mini mart, Laura had told the rest of the group that there were only 2 people inside the store. We all know that there were actually 3. So Laura had either miscounted, misspoke, or she lied. Heather then handed DeMarcus the Duranger, and Marvelous took his own .25 caliber gun, and they got out of the car. The 2 boys burst into the store and ran right to Sarah with their guns raised. They ordered Sarah to give them whatever money was in the register, and she did as they asked, but there wasn't much to give them. The drawer had less than $50 in the till. She gave them what they had come for in hopes that they would leave, but they didn't. DeMarcus was the first to fire, hitting Jones. Marvelous then shot Sarah in the face. One or both of them, it's unclear, shot Jimmy, who slumped over the counter, and the teens ran. But what they didn't know was that their bullets had missed Jimmy. The 71-year-old man had slumped over after they fired at him, playing dead. While the group fled the scene, either Jimmy or another bystander, I'm not sure which, it doesn't say, had called the police. Sarah and Jones were rushed to the hospital with obvious life-threatening injuries. Jones survived, but sadly, Sarah did not. Among the police that arrived was Detective Doyle Burke, the detective from the beginning of our case. He described the scene as horrific. There were holiday decorations and candy scattered everywhere, all covered and soaked in blood. Aside from the horrific carnage that lay at the scene, there was something else that caught Burke's eye. Blazer aluminum shell casings lay on the floor under the counter next to a bag of chips. These casings were the same type used at the murder scene of Danita Galette. After finding these, the police were certain this crime was connected to the recent crimes that had been happening in the area over the last few days. Danita had been killed at a phone booth. Richard had been murdered in his car, and just before the Mini Mart shooting, a woman had been held at gunpoint before getting away and having her car stolen. Now, I'm sure that everyone is yelling that I missed one, swearing that I forgot about the murder of Joseph Wilkerson. But I promise I didn't. I didn't mention him because at this point, the police had not yet been made aware of his murder. At first, these crimes had seemed random, but these bullet casings were evidence that each one of these crimes were committed, but that wasn't all that they had. Jimmy's description of the assailants had matched that of the carjacking victim. The theft of the Dodge Shadow was how the police would solve this case. The missing car was the key to solving these crimes. So just as police began to realize they had a spree killer on their hands, the media had got wind of the story, and they dubbed it the Christmas Killings. So just as police began to realize that they had a spree killer on their hands, the media got wind of the story, and they dubbed it the Christmas Killings. After hearing about this killing spree, the people of Dayton were horrified, and rightfully so. The scariest part was the randomness of the victims. No one knew who may be next. By this time, Marvelous, Laura, DeMarcus, and Heather were most likely feeling the pressure of their crimes. As far as they knew, they had just robbed a store in daylight and killed everyone inside. It wasn't going to be easy for them to fly under the radar. And they began to realize that they could actually be caught for what they had done. At this time, the four decided to change the plates on the cars that they had stolen. So they put Joseph's Grand Am plates onto the Dodge and the Dodge plates onto the Grand Am. But would this be enough to hide from the police? Exactly. No, definitely not. Like, they're both stolen cars. It was not something they thought through very well.
No.
Like, the more cases that I hear and the more that we cover, like, it just amazes me how these criminals are able to pull off all these crimes and do all the things that they do, but they're so stupid.
And that's exactly how they get caught.
Exactly. Like, I don't know. I don't get it. Either way, I mean, obviously, I'm glad that they're stupid because they get caught, but it still amazes me.
Yeah.
So just the day before, the four of them had been bragging to their friends about what they had done. And a lot of people now knew about what the group had been up to. To name a few, there's Nick Woodson and his girlfriend Melissa, Jeffrey Wright, who they had already attempted to kill, Wendy Cottrell and her boyfriend, Marvin Washington. And now they began to regret bragging to all these people, which left them wondering, were their friends allies or were they liabilities? DeMarcus told Marvelous that he thought that two of their friends within the posse were going to rat them out. He was talking about 16-year-old runaway Wendy Cottrell and her 18-year-old boyfriend Marvin Washington. And these two were believed to be the biggest threat to them. They both had seen Joseph's dead body and had been present when they attempted to kill Jeffrey Wright. So the two of them could lead the police to Joseph's body and all four of them. So on Saturday morning, December 26th, shortly after they had shot up the corner mini mart, the gang of young violent killers set out to tie up the loose ends that they had left behind. Marvelous, DeMarcus, Laura, and Heather all climbed into the car and set off a little after 9 a.m. The foursome had picked up Wendy, Marvin, and Nick. But Nick didn't feel right. Whether he had overheard the plans to kill their friends, no one is sure. But either way, he knew something wasn't right, and he asked to be let out of the car, which Marvelous allowed. The group was out driving around and drinking when Marvelous decided to stop and visit his brother's grave, which totally random, but go visit your brother, whatever. So after this, the group of teens had drove around until Marvelous said he had to go to the bathroom. So they pulled the car over into an isolated gravel yard that was owned by the city. Then, once Marvelous and DeMarcus were out of the car, they forced Wendy and Marvin out. The two boys then pulled out their guns and forced both Wendy and Marvin over to a gravel pit behind some rocks. Marvelous put his gun to Wendy's mouth while she swore she hadn't and wouldn't tell anyone what she knew. But in the end, it didn't matter what she said. DeMarcus fired, killing Marvin, and Marvelous followed, killing Wendy. Both were shot in the head. The two boys then returned to the car, where DeMarcus reloaded his gun and went back to shoot their victims more. Marvin was shot a total of 10 times, and Wendy was shot 3 times. So now, what happened to Nick after he left the car? What did he decide to do with whatever it was that he knew? Well, he went to his aunt's house looking to hide out from his fellow posse members, but they would unfortunately find him hiding out there later. They weren't there to kill him, though. Instead, they wanted Nick to kill his girlfriend, Melissa. So if you remember, Heather had told Melissa where they had gotten their hands on those expensive Fila shoes. And the group was convinced that Melissa was going to run to the police with everything she knew, so she had to go. What they didn't know, though, was that Nick had already called in a tip to the police tip line. So thanks to Nick, the police now knew all about the downtown posse and exactly who their killers were. Dayton police had gotten alert to be on the lookout for the Dodge Shadow and the 14s. Around 1:40 p.m. on December 26th, Sergeant Huber was patrolling the west side of the Miami River. Hearing the broadcast come out about the stolen car, he looked in areas where he had found stolen cars in the past, hoping that he would spot it. One of these places was the same street as the Woodson house, and the same place where the group had parked the Grand Am stolen from Joseph. As Huber drove past the street, he seen the Dodge Shadow, but after getting a closer look, he was confused because the plates didn't match the stolen car. And parked nearby, he saw the Grand Am, which those plates didn't match that car either, because they had swapped the plates out. So Huber called it in and decided to hide in an alley to stake it out, certain that he was onto something. While he sat and wait, the group were beginning to panic. They had seen him circle the block in his police cruiser, and they knew their safe place wasn't safe anymore. So once they couldn't see the police car any longer, the foursome decided to flee. They ran from the Woodson home and piled into the Dodge Shadow. So now these monstrous killers had left Nick standing inside his aunt's home, terrified. His so-called friends had already killed 6 people, and 2 of those were their friends. Now they wanted Nick to kill his own girlfriend. Nick didn't know what to do. He knew he couldn't just sit there. And I'm sure he probably believed that the group would eventually come back to kill him too, because at this point, the group were like cornered animals. So he decided he only had one choice left. Nick called the police again. After he spoke with officers, units across the city got an urgent radio call with information about the Dodge Shadow that they had been looking for, and now they were told that there were guns inside the car as well. At the same time that this is happening, Sergeant Huber sees the Dodge take off and calls it in. He needed backup, but he knew if he waited too long, the teens would get away, and so he followed them. With Huber following behind them, the teens decided to stop the car. A door flew open, and DeMarcus leapt from the car and took off running. Huber couldn't follow DeMarcus without letting the other suspects go, so he decided to stay with the Dodge. Aside from DeMarcus jumping from the car, no one else had made a break for it. The Dodge remained stopped with no movement from what Huber could see. It appeared that the remaining teens were going to cooperate. But inside the car, things were not as calm as they had appeared. Laura did not plan to cooperate at all. She had told Marvelous to shoot the officer. It's not known if Marvelous had planned to listen to Laura or not, because at this very moment, backup had arrived, and once the group saw that they were outnumbered, they didn't resist. Their murderous rampage was over. Inside the car, officers found 2 guns, one loaded with the same Blazer aluminum casings that they had found at a few crime scenes, and a Deranger gun that had been used to kill Richard Maddox. They had also taken notice that Marvelous was wearing Danita's missing jacket. And from here, they returned to the Woodson house where they had found DeMarcus, who was wearing Danita's Fila shoes. The downtown posse had been captured, and the horrific Christmas weekend had finally come to an end. But investigators had no idea just how bad the spree had truly been, until they decided to pay a visit to Joseph Wilkerson, the owner of the Grand Dam that the teens had been using in their spree. When investigators arrived at the Wilkerson house, no one answered, of course, and Detective Burke caught scent of an odor. Upon this, they entered the house. Once inside, they could see the house had been ransacked. It was a total mess, and then they found Joseph Wilkerson, tied to his headboard by electrical cords, dead, right where the group of teens had left him. Here, they found the same ammunition used in each of the other crimes. So now, the teens are officially linked to 4 different murders. There was solid evidence that would put these killers away, but Dayton police wanted a confession. So first, they interviewed Laura. Laura, at only 16, was the youngest of the group, and they believed that her being so young, she would be more susceptible in an interrogation. But they were wrong. Laura was an iron trap, and she didn't say a single word. And when she asked to use the restroom, she did so on their floor. So then Marvelous was taken into his own interrogation room and was held for 3 hours before detectives came in. Once they did, Marvelous talked for 45 minutes, and they interviewed him again the following day. According to police, and as seen in interrogation footage, Marvelous was of sound mind despite his claims of being highly intoxicated. Heather and DeMarcus talked almost immediately. They each told detectives what they had done and what they had planned to do. And according to them, the group was on their way to kill 3 more people when they were apprehended. The demeanor of the group had apparently unnerved some of the officers that had spoke with them as well. According to Dayton Daily News, one of the investigators said that they weren't remorseful at all. They were only mad that officers had stopped them before they could kill the others that they had planned to kill. So at this point, 3 out of the 4 teens had talked. But for detectives, this wasn't enough. They wanted to hear from Laura. One source said that a minister who had known Laura had called police and offered to speak with her, and it seems that that's all she needed to talk. Laura had told the minister that there were 2 more bodies the police had yet to find. But according to the minister, she wasn't so much as making a confession as she was bragging about what she had done. So at this point, the police had no idea that Wendy and Marvin were dead. So this revelation was a big surprise to them. But they followed up with what Laura had to say. They went to the location that she said, And there, they found evidence of a murder, as well as the bodies of 16-year-old Wendy and 18-year-old Marvin. In the wake of these new victims and all of the evidence against them, each teen was hit with a slew of charges. And in the summer of 1993, each would answer for their crimes. At their trials, there was a large amount of evidence connecting them to each murder. The matching bullets, the stolen cars, items taken from their victims, witness accounts, including that of Nick Woodson, as well as all three confessions. Heather herself would turn witness for the prosecution, and even though she had agreed to testify against the others, she still received 2 consecutive life terms in prison, for a total of 182 years. So, I'm going to make a clarification really quick before I go on. When it comes to multiple sentences, there are 2 ways that they can be served. There's consecutive and concurrent. Concurrent terms means that they will run at the same time. So basically, you're serving your sentence for both crimes at the exact same time. Dadgummit. A consecutive term means that you will do time for one crime. Then, once you've served the time for that, you will begin to serve the time for your second crime. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move on to the others. So Laura and DeMarcus were minors, but they had been tried as adults. DeMarcus had pled guilty to multiple felonies and was sentenced to 186 years. Laura was given the lightest sentence of them all. She received 133 years. Marvelous, at 19, was legally an adult, and the death penalty was on the table for him. He filed a total of 26 appeals, including one based on racial discrimination, and all 26 were overturned. In the end, Marvelous was convicted in 5 of the 6 murders by 3 judges because he had waived his right to a trial by jury. In the summer of 2009, Marvelous was executed by lethal injection, and he had no last words. There's a lot of debate about what really drove these teens to kill. For most of the Dayton police force, the driving factor was greed. But even they are confused about how their initial robbery turned into such a bloody weekend. A fellow downtown posse member says that no one has to look too hard for a reason. She said they killed just because they wanted to kill. So looking at it, the group's actions seem as if they came out of nowhere. But people like this group of teens aren't created overnight. The circumstances that drove them to where they ended up can't be ignored. Each one of them grew up on a forgotten side of a crumbling city that was full of violence and raked with trauma. For others like Marvelous, a sudden and brutal death turned his entire world upside down, and this made him see just how much around him was out of his control. No one really knows why this group of teens did what they did. No matter the reason, something we all know without a shadow of a doubt is that they took 6 innocent lives, they left a slew of living victims behind them, and they turned a small city's Christmas wonderland into a Christmas nightmare that will never be forgotten. And that is the 1992 Dayton, Ohio Christmas killings. It's a pretty brutal and messed up one. That's for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there was some definite stuff going on there that I'm not sure if anyone knows.
Right.
But one was executed, the others are all in prison for the rest of their lives. They definitely got what they deserved, that's for sure.
Definitely.
All right. So I do have some photos that I'll put those on the Facebook as always, which that link can be found in the episode description like normal. Do you have any final thoughts, Ashley?
No, I don't.
All right, well, that is it for this one. And we will be back for this week with Ashley's bonus episode. Make sure to come back for that one. Make sure you please give us a rate and a review. Don't forget to subscribe so you get notifications when our new episodes are released. We hope you keep listening, and remember to
watch for monsters.
And don't kill people.
And everybody have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.